Well, let's dive into this story that really makes you wonder, how a 74-year-old grandmother with like a spotless record could end up robbing a bank.
Yeah.
We're talking about this woman, Ann Mayers, right? And she's the seemingly ordinary grandmother who, out of the blue, decides to hold up a bank.
Right.
It just doesn't fit the typical criminal profile, does it?
It's a fascinating case, isn't it? Because when we think about bank robbers,
Yeah.
You picture career criminals, hardened individuals who are used to operating outside the law.
Right.
But Anne's story challenges that whole notion, and it forces us to ask what happens when an ordinary person gets caught in such a desperate situation that they feel like they have no other choice.
Yeah, and it's unsettling to even think about. So let's rewind to April 19th, 2024.
Okay.
The scene is the AurGroup Credit Union in Fairfield Township, Ohio. Anne walks in no mask, no elaborate disguise, just an older woman with 2 bags.
And according to eyewitnesses, she seemed almost ordinary,
Right.
which makes the events that unfolded even more shocking.
Because in a flash, everything changes. She approaches the teller, pulls out a handgun, a real one, and demands they fill one of her bags with cash. Now imagine being that teller for a second. You never expect something like that to happen.
Right.
But suddenly you're staring down the barrel of a gun.
Absolutely. And it's a stark reminder that this is not a movie.
No.
This is real life with real consequences, and those consequences were very real for Anne.
Okay.
She managed to get away in a silver Hyundai. Elantra even tried to cover her tracks by removing the license plate. But let's be honest, it wasn't the most cunning getaway.
No.
The police were able to track her down to her home in Hamilton, Ohio, where she was arrested without incident.
So at this point, it seems like an open and shut case.
Yeah.
Right. Wrong. Because
Yeah.
this is where the story takes that unbelievable turn. During questioning, Anne confesses to the robbery. But then her family comes forward with a bombshell. Anne had recently fallen victim to a vicious online scam.
Right.
And we're not talking about a small amount of money here.
Not at all. Reports indicate she had been tricked into sending over $80,000 to these scammers.
Wow.
She had drained her savings, even borrowed money from family and friends, all in the false hope of some big payout that never came.
It's heartbreaking. You can only imagine the desperation, the shame, the feeling of betrayal that must have been eating away at her.
Yeah.
But even with this new information, the law is the law. And Anne was charged with aggravated robbery and tampering with evidence.
Wow.
Her defense tried to argue that her actions stemmed from the incredible stress and potential mental effects of the scam, but the prosecution pushed back hard. They said, look, she still made the choice to rob that bank. And sadly, despite the unusual circumstances, Anne ended up pleading guilty in September of 2024.
And that plea, while it might bring a sense of closure to the legal process, it opens up a whole new set of questions about justice, mercy, and the lasting impact of these scams.
Exactly. Because we're left to wonder, was Anne in her right mind when she decided to rob that bank? Could the trauma of the scam, the financial ruin, the sheer emotional weight of it all, have actually impaired her judgment? That's what we're going to explore as we learn more about Ann Mayer's story. We're back, and you might be thinking, okay, she got scammed, but how does that explain robbing a bank? And it's a fair question. But this is where we need to understand the real psychological damage these scams inflict. It's not just about the money. It's about the mind games, the manipulation, the sheer emotional wreckage they leave behind.
Right.
And to help us unpack all of that, we turn to the experts at the SCARS Institute.
Yeah.
They specialize in understanding the impact of scams on victims.
Right.
And they've got some really eye-opening insights into Ann Mayer's case.
Yeah, one of the key things the SCARS Institute emphasizes is the concept of grooming.
Grooming.
It sounds almost clinical, doesn't it? But that's precisely what these scammers do. They methodically groom their victims, just like predators in the wild.
So these scammers aren't just sending out random phishing emails. They're strategically targeting and manipulating people.
Exactly. They prey on vulnerabilities, loneliness, financial insecurity, maybe even the simple desire for a little excitement or romance. They build trust often over weeks or even months, showering their victims with attention, affection, and promises of a brighter future.
So they create this whole elaborate facade to draw their victims in.
Precisely. And as the relationship deepens, the scammer starts to make requests. Small favors at first, maybe a loan to help with a supposed emergency. And because the victim has been so skillfully groomed, they willingly comply. They've been conditioned to trust to believe that the scammer has their best interests at heart.
It's chilling how calculated it all is. But at some point, the victim has to realize they're being scammed, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But that's where the real mind-bending part comes in. You see, as the victim starts to hand over larger sums of money, they enter a state of what we call cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance. Break that down for me.
Essentially, it's that mental tug-of-war we experience when we're holding on to two conflicting beliefs. In this case, it's the clash between the nagging feeling that something isn't right. Maybe the scammer stories don't quite add up, or they keep coming up with new excuses, and the desperate desire to believe that this person they've come to trust, this person who's promised them a better life, isn't actually deceiving them.
So it's like their heart is saying one thing, but their gut is screaming something else entirely.
Exactly. And to resolve that inner conflict, victims often double down on their belief in the scammer. They rationalize the inconsistencies, they ignore the red flags, all to avoid facing the painful truth that they've been duped.
And that's where the real damage starts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because when the truth finally does come out, and it almost always does, the victim is hit with a wave of emotions. Shame, guilt, anger, and most importantly, trauma. Imagine realizing that you've been lied to, manipulated, and robbed by someone you trusted. It's devastating.
And that trauma, as the Scars Institute points out, doesn't just disappear overnight. It can have a lasting impact on a person's mental and emotional well-being.
Right.
But can it really affect someone's judgment, their ability to make rational decisions to the point where something like robbing a bank seems like the only option?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And to understand the answer, we need to dig a little deeper into how trauma affects the brain. Think of your brain like a computer. When it's working correctly, it processes information smoothly, allowing you to make clear-headed decisions. But when you experience trauma, it's like a virus has infected your system.
So the trauma disrupts the brain's normal functioning.
Exactly. The amygdala, which is like the brain's alarm system, goes into overdrive, triggering a cascade of stress hormones that can cloud your judgment and impair your impulse control.
So it's like your brain is stuck in fight or flight mode even when there's no immediate danger.
Precisely. And when your brain is flooded with stress hormones, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational thinking and decision-making, can't function at its best. It's like trying to run a complex program on a computer that's riddled with malware. It's just not going to work properly.
That makes a lot of sense. But how does that relate to Ann Mayer's case specifically?
Well, the Scars Institute argues that in cases of severe trauma, like what Anne experienced after losing her life savings to a scammer, the brain's ability to process information and make sound judgments can be significantly impaired.
So, in essence, they're saying that she might not have been thinking clearly when she robbed that bank.
That's precisely what they're suggesting. They're not saying she wasn't aware of what she was doing, but they're raising the possibility that her capacity for rational thought, her ability to fully grasp the consequences of her actions, was compromised because of the trauma she'd endured.
So it's not about excusing her actions, but understanding the factors that might have contributed to them.
Exactly. And this is where the conversation about justice and mercy gets really interesting, because if trauma can truly impair our cognitive function to this extent, shouldn't that be taken into account when we're talking about guilt and punishment?
That's a huge question, and one we'll definitely be diving into more
Right after.
So we're left grappling with this really unsettling idea that trauma, the kind of deep psychological trauma inflicted by these scammers, could actually impair someone's ability to make rational decisions to the point where they commit a crime they'd never even dream of otherwise. Like the scam itself set off a chain reaction, ultimately leading to the bank robbery.
Yeah, and it's a difficult concept to wrap your head around, isn't it? Because we like to believe that we're in control of our actions, that we have free will.
Yeah.
But what if our brains, the very organ responsible for our choices, have been hijacked by trauma? It challenges our whole notion of responsibility and culpability.
It really does. So where do we draw the line? How do we balance the need for justice with the understanding that sometimes people aren't acting entirely of their own free will? It's like the police sergeant on the case, Brandon McCroskey, said, yes, Anne was a victim of a scam, but she still made the conscious choice to walk into that bank and put those people in danger.
Right. It's a valid point, and one that highlights the immense complexity of this case. We can't ignore the very real harm that Anne's actions caused. But the Scars Institute would likely argue that this is precisely where we need a more nuanced understanding of trauma and its impact on decision-making.
It's almost like we need to look beyond the act itself to the root cause to truly understand what happened. And in Anne's case, that root cause wasn't greed or malice. It was desperation born from the trauma of being manipulated and financially devastated.
Exactly. Yeah. And while that doesn't excuse her actions, it does provide critical context. It suggests that her capacity for making sound judgments, for fully grasping the consequences of her actions, might have been compromised. And that's a game changer when it comes to determining an appropriate response from the justice system.
So what does all of this mean for Anne Mayers? What should her sentence be? It's a tough call and one that ultimately rests with the judge. But regardless of what happens in the courtroom, her story has sparked a much larger conversation, one that extends far beyond this single case.
Absolutely. Because Anne's story is a stark reminder that scams aren't just about financial loss. They're about the violation of trust, the infliction of deep psychological wounds that can have far-reaching consequences. And if we as a society are going to effectively combat this epidemic, we need to start by acknowledging the very real and lasting trauma these scams inflict.
You know, as we've been discussing this, I keep thinking about something you said earlier, that the scammers groom their victims often over long periods of time, building trust and exploiting vulnerabilities. It's incredibly calculated and devious.
It is, and it highlights the need for greater awareness and education. We need to teach people how to spot the warning signs, how to protect themselves from falling prey to these manipulative tactics.
And maybe even more importantly, we need to create a culture where victims feel safe coming forward, where they're not met with judgment or shame, but with compassion and support. Because the trauma of the scam is already devastating enough. The last thing victims need is to feel isolated and alone.
Well said. Anne Mayer's story is a tragedy on so many levels. But if there's one positive thing to come out of it, I hope it's a greater awareness of the human cost of these scams and a renewed commitment to supporting those who've been affected by them.
I hope so too. Because the truth is, anyone can be a victim of a scam. It doesn't discriminate based on age, education, or social status. But by understanding the tactics these scammers use, by recognizing the signs of grooming and manipulation, and by creating a support system that empowers victims to come forward and get help, we can work together to prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place. And that's it for this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, explored some really complex issues, but if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's this. Be vigilant, be informed, and most importantly, be kind to yourself and others. Until next time.